So in the last video, the 350Z developed a lovely, lovely rod knock. In this video, we're going to be fixing that. How we're fixing it, you yet to see. First thing we're going to do though, get this front end straight off. Let's go.
That's right, so today's a biggie. We're changing the engine on the 350Z, and this is definitely the biggest challenge that we've took on so far with this car. And we set ourselves a little challenge. At this point, I set a timer, and I wanted to see if we could complete this in just 24 hours, and I know that's a big challenge, but let's see if we can do it. So the first step, once the front end was off, was to drain out all of the aircon systems and disconnect everything on the front end so we could start removing the slam panel and the radiator pack so we could take the engine out the front of the car. So this video would not have been possible today without our man Bertie. We met him once on a drift day previously, and he's got a V8 swapped 350Z, and he really kindly popped up to me once he'd seen the video that the 350Z had died, saying that he'd happily volunteer to help me swap this engine out. What an absolute legend. Matt and Liam also popped by, and I'd say they were giving a hand, but it was a different sort.
Not there yet, not there yet, not there yet.
So after Bertie had finished telling us about how big the fish was that he'd caught, we could start seriously cracking on with getting this engine ripped out. So next up was to start draining the old engine of all the fluids. So out comes the oil first, which as you can imagine had a little bit of a shimmer to it, and after that the coolant. Next thing to come off was the decap pipes, which we fitted in a previous video. I'll leave a link in the top right hand corner. Because these were so fresh on the car, the bolts were super easy to get off. After that we started unbolting the gearbox, but strangely enough not all of them are tight. This car's obviously had a clutch or something in the past, and whoever's fitted it didn't necessarily fit this bolt the best.
Tight.
So with everything underneath the car disconnected, it was time to remove the rest of the front end, ready for the engine to come out. Now we didn't actually have one of the tools that we needed to remove the aircon pipes, so we just loosened off the rad pack so we could move it forward slightly, so we had a little bit of extra room to get the engine out from the top. Now we did also want to make sure that we didn't damage anything in the process of taking the engine out, so the radiator comes out as well as the fans to give us that extra bit of room. So next up, off comes the fuel line, and then we disconnected the loom from the ECU and actually left the rest of it attached to the engine. Take it away, feeling too good to me. Chilling all day, all in your space is where I wanna be. So now the engine is nearly out. The final bolts underneath the car are just for the engine mounts, which actually is surprisingly accessible.
Last bolt. Ooh, jeez! Oh man, I actually missed. That's it.
Thinking for myself, asking for help, but nothing seems to work on you.
So the next thing to do is find a suitable point to strap the engine up and attach the engine crane, and then we can start taking it out. So after a careful shimmy out the car, it was finally free, and we could start having a look at the damage that had been caused by running it low on oil. So after removing all the 10 mils which attached the sump, we could then pull it off and have a look at the extent of the damage. And I think it's safe to say all of these chunks should definitely not be in your oil, and this is kind of the reason why we chose not to rebuild this, because we don't know how much damage that will have caused to this engine. Now, if you are interested in buying the old engine from this car, please do hit me up. I'll leave my Instagram at the bottom of the screen now. Obviously, it's going to need some rebuilding, or it may be the ideal candidate for forging or whatever it may be, but yeah, just let me know if you're interested. You never leave my thoughts alone, yeah, you. You're the reason I'm going out my mind. I just
So that's the old engine out of the car. RIP to this lump. Now we've got something to replace this. We're not going to be rebuilding this one, so let's take a look at what we got. So this is the new engine and it's a like-for-like replacement. I've opted not to convert this car just out of speed, really. I wanted to keep the project moving forward and be able to drive the car and not have it sat on my drive or somewhere irritating. So hopefully we can get this in pretty speedy and get back on the road.
So the first challenge was getting this engine out of the van. We actually managed to get this in the van by backing a recovery truck straight up to the back of it and just shoving it in. But getting it on the floor was a different story. It had a very diddy little ratchet strap holding it onto a pallet. So we very carefully lowered it down onto tyres and dragged it onto the engine crane. So there's a few parts we wanted to take off the old engine and fit to the new one, as some parts were looking better than others. The first thing to come off was the sump, as the one on the new one was dented, so we wanted to use the one off the old one, obviously after we cleaned it up. Now we also found this little bolt hiding in the auxiliary belt, which could have caused a little bit of damage if it went unnoticed. Also, the engine mounts on the new engine were not only stuck to the subframe which came with the engine, but also in very bad shape. So again, we took the ones off the old one and fitted them straight up to the new one as well. To do this and access it, we also had to remove the manifold, which wasn't too bad considering the engine was off the car. I want to apologise as well, by the way, because some of these clips are a bit sped up, obviously, so it makes it a bit more watchable. But because the engine's rocking around whilst it's sped up, it does make you feel a little bit funny, so sorry about that one. So we also changed over a power steering cooler pipe, I believe it was anyway, and also the auxiliary belts as they were looking in better shape on the old engine. We also swapped over the clutch too, as it turned out we had an aftermarket upgraded one already fitted. Next, the old cleaned up sump goes onto the new engine with a fresh layer of sealant on there too. It was actually surprising how much time it took swapping all these little bits over. Obviously the day was cracking on a bit and we were getting a bit more tired, but yeah, surprisingly time consuming. But now the new engine was ready and we could start dropping that into the car and having a wrestle with it, getting it in line with the mounts and also bolted up to the gearbox. So as the night cracked on, we started reassembling the car, bolting back up the gearbox, reattaching the fuel lines, plugging in the ECU, all of the things that we'd done to remove the engine from the car. So obviously we wanted to make sure this engine was as healthy as possible, so we pop on a fresh oil filter and obviously some new oil in there to the correct level.
Okay, so now just ticked over 24 hours. We had to go home and take a rest, have about 5 hours sleep, and now we're back down here. And I think we're just about ready to fire it up for the first time, or try to. We're going to double check over everything, and then we'll see if it starts. Okay, so the engine's sitting on the mounts, the MAF is plugged in, but the airbox isn't connected, that's fine. We haven't got the radiator on yet, but that's not a problem. I think we've got all the sensors plugged in, we've got the ECU plugged in, fuel's all connected, and also, most importantly, we've got some oil in this time, so yeah, let's give it a go. Hey up. Oops. So everything is sounding pretty good and pretty sweet. We can start looking at getting the car back together now. But there's a light on the dash which was never on before. Can you see down here? I now have an oil level light, which I think is going to be very helpful for the future. So God knows why that didn't work before. But let's start getting this mess back together.
So we missed our 24-hour deadline, unfortunately, but it's not the end of the world. We still had some time to get this car finished off and get it back on the road. And to be honest with you, I don't really know where the time went on this. It took just over 3 hours to get the engine out. We probably had 3 hours with the engine side by side before we started putting it back in. But I suppose it's just one of those things. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. So anyway, now we know that the car starts, we can start connecting up the final bits and pieces. So on go the coolant pipes, and we're going to flush the old coolant out of the system, just using water on the first few runs, and then put in some proper coolant at the end. I just want to take this chance as well, just to shout Bertie out once more. He was an absolute godsend through this, with mad mechanical knowledge and a pure go-get-it, no problems attitude, which I absolutely love. I'm going to leave a link to his Instagram and his Facebook page down in the description. Make sure you go and pop him a follow and check out his company. He's based in Doncaster and specialises in MOTs, services and repairs, but he may do a job like this for you if you ask nicely. So the next thing to do was connect the exhaust back up to the car, because we wanted to run the car up to temperature and also not to deafen ourselves. Now, we did have a small leak when we did this, and there was quite an obvious reason why. We had two pipes, one on the car and one on the engine, which were both exactly the same, that we just didn't hook back up. So once we removed one of them and connected it back onto the engine, we were good to go. So now that that's fixed, we can reconnect the airbox, and then we can run the car up to temperature and bleed the coolant system for the first time. So there was quite a lot of water coming out of the exhaust, which did concern me a little bit at first, but it turns out it was just condensation from the engine being sat for a while. So once it had ran and got up to temperature, it did clear itself.
Okay, so now we're happy with how the engine's running. We're going to start reassembling the front end, but there's a few weird things that we've noticed along the way whilst dismantling this car and taking the old engine out. One of them was the airbox was full of, I don't know what it was just full of crap, and we reckon that must have been from mice as well. But also underneath the dash, we had all of this blue tissue which was soaked through with water, or, oh, I hope it's water anyway, but that might be the cause of my smell, so hopefully that's that fixed. But the final thing as well is on the old engine. We just tipped this upside down, and this is what came out at the top of it. So mice or rats have definitely been here, but hopefully now we've got rid of that engine and that manky tissue out of the dash. That'll be that smell fixed. So anyway, let's get on with it.
So finally, the front end is going back on the car. The bumper, headlights and bonnet can be reattached now that we're confident that the engine's running properly. And a final flush of the coolant system with some proper coolant, and our boy Bertie gets soaked.
So it's now been about 7 days since we completed the engine swap or change on the 350Z. And you're probably curious as to how successful doing that job was. Well, here she is. So if I'm being 100% truthful and honest, I was expecting to have some teething problems with the car once we got this new engine in. And I thought it'd give better content being honest about that, but to be honest with you, it's been flawless. If there's one thing that this video's taught you, is don't be a prune like me. Go and check your oil. But that's all for this time. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, smash a like on the video. We're going to carry on with modifying the 350Z next time, and I'll catch you then.